Welcome back, part 5 in the Leigh jig series. Today's the turn of the sliding dovetail, the stopped sliding dovetail to be precise. If that sounds interesting, stick around. So welcome back. In the last episode we got to this point of the project. We've done the box joints for the outside frame and we've done a through sliding dovetail for this internal partition. Today I want to turn our attention to this partition here and these internal partitions. I've already prepped the stock and I've sized the stock, so the vertical partition here is set 18mm in from the front, and these partitions here, these small shelves, are set 18mm in from that vertical partition. And that's a little bit of a design feature, but also so we can look at those sliding stopped dovetail joints. In the last video we also spent a lot of time setting up the jig for this particular project. So in theory I don't need to set up the jig again. I know a few of you have commented that yeah, it seems quite complicated to set up, and it's not complicated, but it takes a bit of time, bit of persistence to get the joints where you want them to be. But the promise of the jig is once you've set it up and you've made a note of those settings, you do not need to set the jig up again for similar types of joints. So there's a lot of setup today that we don't have to do. So to put that to the test, we are just going to rely on the marks and the measurements that we took last time. We're not going to reset the set of the router bit. That's going to be the 8mm that was set on the previous project. We're going to use the markings on the jig to set the male part of the joint at 11.5mm and the female part at 8mm. I'll do no test cuts, we'll go straight into the project and we'll get that done, and we'll see how repeatable this thing is. Although I've not seen it discussed anywhere, this jig has a minimum clamping capacity. Now what I mean by that is we are going to cut in the end of our wood the male part of the sliding dovetail, and to do that the material is clamped in this front clamp bracket and brought up to those fingers and clamped into position. So it therefore follows that this material has got to be long enough to be clamped into this clamp. If it's shorter, it won't be clamped, and therefore you can't make the joint on the Leigh jig. So when I think about how long these have got to be from left to right in this orientation, that's got to be long enough for this clamp to work. Now we know that we're using a backer board in our jig. Now the backer board size that we're using is 18mm. So when we're working out that minimum measurement, we need to allow for that backer board. So with the backer board in place and the fingers tightened down, I need to concern myself with that clamping distance from the underside of the fingers to the bottom of the clamp. And in our case, that measurement is going to be 94mm. So we know that 94 therefore is the minimum length of this partition. Now we know that we're going to have a 8mm female sliding dovetail into this side wall here, which will be the same depth as this one here, 8mm in. So if I measure from that 8mm point, 94 will take me to there. So my 94 mark will take me to there. But there's also going to be, on this side partition, another 8mm joint. So if I measure 8mm in from that part, it'll take me to there. That is going to be the side wall of this internal partition. So that is going to look like that. And that, as you can see, is probably not a bad size for holding one of these bandages, and that's its purpose in life. So that looks good to me. This side here has got to hold a couple of bottles, so there'll be one towards the back of the cabinet and one towards the front of the cabinet. So once again, that looks good to me. Now for our project, those dimensions look okay. But when you're designing your project, remember there's a minimum clamping distance. That's the distance from the bottom of your clamp to the underside of your fingers with your backing board attached. So if I'd have wanted to do something about 80mm on this shelf, I wouldn't be able to do it on this jig unless I devise some alternative clamping methodology. Now I've never seen that mentioned, it's not discussed in the material, I've not seen it mentioned on any videos, but it's one of those things you need to consider when you're doing your overall design. We're in good shape, let's crack on. I now know therefore that my internal partition can be cut to a length of 94mm. We'll make it 95mm, I think. It's just an easier number to remember. So the length of these partitions is 95mm. So that's my side pieces now cut to width, and we know that they are going to come in to that point there, and we know that that point there is going to be 8mm away from the outside edge of the partition that comes up here like this. Now this is 18mm pine, so 9mm is the center, so obviously 9mm from there is our center point, or 1mm from the 8mm, however you want to think about it. So that mark is going to be the center point of our material. Now from the shoulder, that is coming in at 89. So the top one needs to come in similar sort of distance, which is going to be 89. There. So I've now got my two positions here lined up. So now I just need to work out the overall length of this piece, and we can get that stock cut to size. So taking a measurement, that's coming in at 276. So 276 plus 18, that's 9mm either side for the joint, equals 294. 294. So I can now cut this piece for 294 and we can start on the joinery. I'll do that and we'll come back. So this is our vertical partition, and we know it's going to be set back from the front edge, and it's set back by 18mm or so. So I want my shelf to end at that point there. Now when I route through on this and stop, it's going to give me that sort of round profile at the end. So I want to set the end of that round profile back from that edge. We'll make a haunch in this by taking off the male part of the dovetail, and then that will slide over that end, disguising it, and that'll give us a nice joint from the front, and that'll make more sense when we come to do the joint. But for now I want to set the female part of the dovetail back from that front edge, and I'm thinking that we will stop our joint at round about 130 mark, which is going to be there. So our joint will come through like this, and then there'll be a round part of that joint that will sort of kind of end like that, and the end of that joint will be covered up by the board. That's the theory. Now we know that this partition is narrower than the top of the board, and it's narrower by round about 10mm, and that's because we're going to route a 10mm groove at the back to take the back of the cabinet. So we need to allow for that when we route the channel on this side. Now remember, this groove is now stopping 130mm from the back of the board. We allow for this 10mm here, so this one must stop 140 from the back of the board, which is going to be there. So this groove will do something like that. Hope that makes sense. So now we just need to set the jig up to route these two things, or more importantly, just set a stop point to allow for that position. So we're going to start by cutting these grooves. Now I still want to work from my reference edge, but obviously if I put my board on this side, I'm going to have to bring the router in this direction, which is not something I actually want to do. So I'm going to spin this round and reference on this side of the jig. Here we still have two more end stops, and this is still straight edge, so we're going to do the same technique, but I'm going to work from the other end of the jig. So I've already put my vertical board in here, and I'm just going to line this line up that we made earlier on with the edge of the board. Now this is only just going to fit, and in the same way I've got a minimum clamping distance on the front edge, I have a minimum clamping distance on this back edge, and as you can see, that is only just going to clamp it into position. So you need to watch for that in your design as well. And in an ideal world, this could have been done with being a little bit wider. But we're just going to get away with it. I've just put a second board in here to stop this bar twisting, and that's giving me enough clamping force on this where it's nice and firm. But by God, we're close. And now I can route in from this direction. So we now just need to work out where this is going to stop. So by eye, I'm going to line up the outside cutting edge of the router bit with that stop line that we've made here on our material. And that is going to be there. And then on my board, I'm just going to mark a line here, round about the centre of the router bit. So when I get to that point with the centre of my router, I stop and I take it out, and that will have given us the joint that we're looking for. Now remember, for our female cut, we know that the fit is going to be 8mm, and we're not going to recheck it, we're just going to trust it. So I now need to move these fingers to the 8mm position. So now, if the repeatability of the jig has worked, that should give me a router position right down this centre line here. So now, trusting the jig, we'll go ahead and make the cut. So by just trusting the jig now, we're going to go ahead and make this cut. So no test cuts this time, no messing around setting it up, just using those measurements that we took on the last episode. So let's see whether or not this thing is going to work. So we're going to route across, and we're going to stop when the centre point of my router lines up with that mark that we made. Let's go. There we have it. Now notice I didn't pull the router straight up, I stopped and I moved back with the router, and obviously that's because we're making a dovetail shape cut. Now interestingly, straight away I can see that this is not in the centre, so that repeatability may be at question. We'll make the second one. And now here I've run into a problem because I've exceeded the minimum clamping capacity of my jig. And that is very disappointing. So although I can line it up, I have no way of clamping this down. So we're going to have to work out a clamping technique. Okay, so this is the solution that we've come up with. A number of things are causing me problems here. The first one is the clamping capacity of this was too great to hold my wood securely. So I've had to improvise on the clamping, and simply I've just made some sticks here that are temporarily bonded to this piece of wood, supported at the back, and this is really clamped down, and that gives me quite firm clamping position, so I think that's going to be okay. The second thing is the material was too short to reference on this backstop, so I couldn't square the thing up, and that's forced me into having to make a climb cut through this piece of wood. Again, this is securely clamped now. I've got the black piece of here to guide my bush, and it's all resting nice and flat on the fingers, so I should be in good shape. So this is not ideal. Now that's beginning to give me the thought that this is probably not an ideal solution when you're making smaller boxes that a lot of us will do, and very often it's a nice design feature to have that sliding dovetail inside a smaller box. But this has a capacity, that 94mm capacity on the front clamping, and round about 170mm minimum clamping on the back capacity. Interesting. Okay, so we've improvised. I think we've got round the problem. I'm still set at 8, and I'm still set at 8. I'm lined up now on the front edge. Everything's square and it's clamped securely. So now we can go ahead and make the cut. And we've got away with it, so maybe we are in good shape. Now what I'm just checking here is to see whether my two shoulders line up and whether those two grooves line up, and yeah, they do. So we are actually in pretty good shape with the cut at the end of the day, so things are going to come out square. So the end result was okay, but yeah, some limitations on the jig that's well worth being aware of when you're doing your design. So now we can go ahead and we can make the male part of the cut on this. No need to stop it this time. We're going to go all the way through on both sides using the settings that we had yesterday. So let's do that. Just going to back aboard to make sure my fingers are at the right height. And now I clamp this one at the front up against the bottom of the fingers. I also want to put a scrap piece of wood on this side to prevent tear out. So that's looking good there. Make sure it's all nice and tight and firm, and we can clamp all this into position. I now set this to 11.5 on the male side, and we make the cut. Yep, and that's still going to be a good fit. So obviously the accuracy and the repeatability is all intact on that jig. So you can see what I mean by the stop joint, and you can see now how this is going to overhang that front of that joint. That is going to cut out to round about, and similarly on this side, round about there. So this piece now will be flush with the shoulder line, overhanging the front edge, and give you a nice clean joint. It's pretty easy to cut this out. We're going to come in with a fine saw. So with that mark made, and I'll just cut down square to the shoulder lines down to that line, and similarly square to the shoulder lines down to that line, and then I'll just use the saw to come in from the top, and that will then give me a clean edge. So very carefully line up against your shoulder lines. Wow, look at that movement on that bench. And then carefully work down to that line. Doesn't matter if you go a little bit past that line, but what's critical is that you stay square to your shoulders. So I'm just going to cut down on this one. Like so. And then I'll just use a chisel to just gently pare that down to the line. Like so. And what we end up with is a nice clean shoulder line here and a nice clean shoulder line there. So we'll go ahead and reassemble this so you can see what we've done, and then it's a matter of rinsing and repeating for these side partitions, and hopefully we get a good fit. Now obviously this is not glued yet, this is just very loose clamping, but you can see what we were after. So you can see that these hinged joints now make a very neat front profile, and when this is all clamped and glued, that will look really, really good. So that's it, that's how you do stopped, hinged, sliding dovetails on the Leigh jig. I'll do these exactly the same way that we've just done the other ones, just a couple of shelves inside here, and I'll get that done off camera. I'll get this glued up, and on the next episode we'll start to look at the blind dovetails and the through dovetails as we make the draw unit. Hope you find this useful. I'll see you next time.